says that. Also, God does not tempt anyone. So temptation does not come from God. So when you face temptation, no one should say, this is one of those commands we were talking about, no one should say, God is tempting me. Right? Temptation and testing and trials, two different things. And so God is not going to, tempt you to see, let's see how committed they really are. Let's put that bad thing in front of them and see if they do it. This is not from God. Temptation does not come from God. He makes that abundantly clear. So none of us get to blame God when we face temptation. When we walk through temptation, it comes in front of us and we face it. None of us get to look to God and somehow blame him. And James makes it clear. We cannot say this. We cannot blame him. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 does tell us a little bit of a role that God does kind of interfere with temptation. He says this, it says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so you can endure it. That's good news right there. That is such good news. So temptation in life is unavoidable, right? It's unavoidable. We're going to face it. But nothing is too much for us to bear. God is not tempting us. He is not the source of temptation. But he does make it so that we cannot be tempted beyond what we can bear. And also, when the temptation comes, he puts the exit ramp in and says, here's the way out. So it is not more than you can bear, and there is an exit that I am making. So you will face the temptation, but there's no excuse. It will not be more than you can bear, and there will always be an exit that I provide so that you can endure it. And that is really good news. So when we are facing temptation in life, and when we fall short and we fall into sin, none of us can say, oh man, it was just more than I could bear. It was just too much. The temptation was just too much. I was just being bombarded. No. Nope. It was not more than you can bear. And God provided an exit. So we don't get to blame God for the temptation. We don't get to say that, well, the devil just tempted me too much and I couldn't take it. We have to look at the man in the mirror. It is on us. And that is exactly what James is challenging us to do. So you are always capable of overcoming the temptation that you face. And it is not God that tempts you, but God is there providing the exit, interfering, making sure that it's not more than you can handle. And then James walks us through the actual process of how we can defeat the temptation that we face. So, a couple things I want to point out, okay? I just want to tell you what's coming so that you can be prepared. We have 3 points today, okay? This is like classic sermon 101. 3 points, okay? You got that? I'm going to need you to remember 3 things. Can we do this? It's going to be easy, okay? The first one is right here, and that's number 1, is to know the source. To know the source. So, here's the crazy thing about this passage. Is this passage that's all about temptation. What I think is really interesting is that it never mentions the devil. Isn't that weird? You think, like, if you're going to talk about temptation, the top of that list is probably going to be the bad guy, right? It's going to be the devil. But James goes through this whole passage about temptation, the source of temptation, how to defeat temptation, overcoming it, and he never even mentions the devil. It's kind of odd, but the thing that James is doing is making us look at ourselves. Just like we talked about how God does not have a nature to sin, so he is ineligible to be tempted. We don't share that same nature. We have a sinful nature. And so we are eligible to temptation, right? We are vulnerable to that temptation. So James doesn't mention the devil. And he tells us that temptation does not come from God, but then he puts the focus on us. Look at yourself and understand why you are vulnerable to the temptation. So if you're struggling with a certain sin, you're the problem. Okay? You are the problem in that situation. So it's not God's fault. And the devil's going to devil. You can't stop the devil from deviling. That's what he does. Devil going to devil. That's what, you know what I'm saying? He's going to do his thing. And so we can't control the devil, and we can't control God. So here we are. We can control ourselves. We have self-control, and God provides the way of escape. And so James says, don't look over there. Don't look over there. Get in the mirror and look at yourself. Okay? You got to get in the mirror and look at yourself. No temptation is too much for you. There is a way of escape. So you have to own it, and you have to take responsibility. Don't blame God. Don't blame the devil. Don't blame people that have wronged you or the people who didn't do the thing that they were supposed to do. You don't get to make excuses. You don't get to blame the circumstances. It's on you. Okay? This is you, because James tells us that this sin is born out of the desires that are within us, the evil desire that is in you. So, the devil might be the one that leads you to the temptation and dangles it in front of you. But if it weren't for our own nature, if it weren't for our own evil desires, the temptation would just be a waste of time, right? Just like God, he can't be tempted. It has no effect on him. But because we are who we are vulnerable to fall short. How many people have used a mousetrap before? You use a mousetrap, right? You get that mousetrap and you crank it back and you put the thing in there. Well, the mouse doesn't just crawl right in and he dies, right? You got to put something out there to lure him in, to entice him, right? So what do? You grab some cheese maybe, and that rat, he smells the cheese, right? And he smells it, and it draws him out from wherever he's hiding, and he comes and he wants the cheese, and he bites that cheese, and then smack, he falls into the trap, and you get him, right? So what James is telling us is that the traps would be meaningless if you weren't a stinking rat that has a desire for cheese, okay? So you got to look at yourself in the mirror and understand the source. You got to understand the source of where this is coming from, that it starts with you. It starts with us. So we can't control these different things in life. We can control ourselves. So we got to understand that we have an enemy that's not going to just give up, that isn't just throwing in the towel. He's going to keep on going, right? And so what are we going to do about us? Right? We talked about the trials in life. Like we can't make enough money to buy our way out of the trials. We can't make our life so comfortable that we will never face tragedies. We're going to face the trials. And so we're going to face the temptation too. And so what are we going to do? We got to know the source of where this is coming from. And the second thing we got to do is know the process. Here's the really cool thing, is that James walks us through this process of temptation and how it all plays out. And what's really cool about this is through pointing that out, it's like getting the enemy's playbook, right? It's like if you're about to go play another team and then you see the plays they're going to run, so you can counter what they're going to do. You know what they're about to do. And so James walks us through the process of how we fall into temptation. So I told you you're going to have to remember 3 things, okay? I'm going to up it a little bit more because point number 2 has 3 steps. Are you ready for this? Okay, so if you're not taking notes, get your pencil ready now, okay? Because now you got to remember 6 things. I won't plop anything else on you. It's just these 6 things, okay? Number 1, number 2, with 3 steps in there, and then we'll go to number 3, okay? Won't be too much. So we got to know the process. He walks us through this process. Step 1 of this process is the desire. I'm going to make it easy. It's all going to start with D, okay? It's all going to start with D. I know. I don't want to give you more than you can bear. I will not give you more than you can bear. I will provide a way for you to remember this easy. So it starts, step number 1, with that desire. So James says in verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Now, when I was studying this scripture this week, I was like, ooh, I got to make a fishing analogy here. This is good, right? Got any fishermen here, right? Oh, we all got fisherman shirts on, so. Well, when you go out and fish, you want to, you think about where you're going, what fish you might be fishing for, and what's that fish want to eat. How am I going to get them on the hook? You don't just throw out the hook You got to lure him. You got to entice him. So that you take a fishing lure, right? That's what they call it. And you take maybe a little fish that's got some hooks on it, or maybe you get a nice juicy worm and you put that, and you hide the hook inside of it, and then you drag that little fish out from where he's hiding, and he gets enticed, and he smells it, and he looks at it, and you're making it look, ooh, you're just a master fisherman. You're making that thing look so real, and he just chomps down, he bites it, and you set that hook, and you reel him in. That's what I thought about. Here's the crazy thing. I started studying it, and James was way ahead of me on this analogy, okay? This is really cool. We talked about how he makes these illustrations and these analogies. He's talking about fishing right here, everybody. This is really cool. So the words in Greek, to draw away, he's talking about, it's a fishing term, to lure something out. So if you're hunting or if you're fishing and that fish or the animal is kind of in its hiding place, you want to draw it out. You want to bring it out from where it's hiding. So whether it's with a bait or with something that smells good or maybe some meat, and you draw that animal into the trap. You're drawing them away from the safety. So you're bringing them out. And so that's the exact term that James uses. So he says that we're drawn out. And then the next word that he uses is enticed. And enticed literally means to bait or to catch something with bait. So this is that juicy worm, and so you're looking at the worm, you're enticed, right? And oh, that looks good, I want it. The rat smells the cheese, and he's just got to take it, and then that hook gets set. So we're drawn away and enticed. So just like a fisherman throws out that lure, and maybe that fish is hiding in the grass, and you pop that worm along the grass, and he pokes his head out and says, ooh, what's that? And he takes a little swim out of the grass, and then he gets a little closer and says, that looks good. And he's now enticed, and he bites on. So this is what James said. He's the master of analogies here, and he's painting this picture. Just like a fisherman or a hunter, which draws the animal out, draws the fish out, they're enticed. And it's not a physical dragging, right? It's not like you're actually being drugged, but it's this figurative drawing them out. They're in the safe place, and you draw them and lead them out. I love this. And so we're drawn out, we're enticed by our own evil desires, the things that are within us. That's step number one, is desire. Step number two is disobedience. It says this in James chapter 1, verse 15. He says, then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Okay? Making another really cool illustration here, conception. He's now talking about making babies, everybody, okay? Men, if I don't have your attention this morning talking about baby making and hunting and fishing, I don't know what to do, okay? This sermon's for you guys. Conception. So after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So there's this conception that takes place. There's this desire, and we're lured and we're enticed. But then there's an action that takes place, the moment of disobedience, where this desire and the temptation, and then you give into it, and there's an action, right? Just like conception, it takes two to tango, where these two things come together. The fish bites onto the bait. He sees it, he's enticed, and then he bites. He snaps at it. The rat takes the cheese, and the trap comes down, where this desire leads us into action, and it leads us to disobedience. Now, temptation is not sin, right? We all face temptation. Jesus faced temptation. He was without sin. So disobedience is where that desire comes into the moment where you bite, where that action takes place and you choose to be disobedient. But this doesn't mean that it always happens outwardly, right? We can talk about, lustful intent. And lustful intent is much different than just acknowledging, hey, that person's kind of attractive. There is an enticement that happens and then an action that follows it. So it can be thoughts that become sinful. That's why the Bible says we got to take every thought captive to make it obedient to God. So there's things that happen in our mind, right? The sin isn't always outward, right? But being tempted is not the sin. It's the moment where we're lured and enticed, and then it leads to a disobedience when that is conceived, where the action takes place. But that can happen inwardly. You talk about hate or greed or lust, like we just did, or envy. All these things are disobedient, but they're not necessarily outwardly actions. So we got to be constantly checking our hearts, renewing our minds, taking every thought captive to make it obedient to God. So it starts, step one, with that desire. The desire leads us into disobedience. And then number 3 leads to death. So he's made these really cool illustrations. We're talking about hunting and fishing. And then he goes to this conception. And now it gets a little morbid, actually. And he says, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Giving birth to death is the imagery of a stillborn baby. And when you read that, it's like tough to swallow. And it feels like, whoa, this got real. Like this, took a turn, and this kind of got extreme. We're talking about hunting and fishing and making babies, and now a stillborn baby. But I think that this extreme example that he uses, it kind of knocks at the door and challenges us to wake up to the reality of what sin actually does in our life. It brings death. It brings death. And so it is extreme. And so when you think about the joy of awaiting a baby, right? The baby's coming, and you're filled with joy and hope and expectation, and then the disappointment and the grief of having a stillborn baby is, extreme. And so I think a lot of times this is where we fall into that trap. When we have the desire and we're enticed, we start thinking through, oh man, this could be satisfying. This could be fulfilling. This could be good, right? And we start to, in our mind, think how this sin might actually be rewarding. It might make us feel something. It might, fill that hole or that emptiness we've been filling. And we start to justify it in our minds, and we start to play these games. But ultimately, it leads us to death. The enemy comes in, and it's like, ooh, look at the cheese. The cheese looks good, right? That's good cheese sitting there on the trap. But it's a trap, right? And so we can't be lured and enticed, because we have to remember where it's heading. We have to remember what the actual result is. It's not just a cheesy buffet. It is death when the trap comes down. There's this story of David and Bathsheba that I just love. And you literally see this in action. I don't know this, but I imagine that this was almost the playbook that James was writing. Like, remember this guy? Is he looking back through this process as how it happened to him? And it just lines up so perfectly. The story of David and Bathsheba. So David is this amazing guy. He's a man after God's own heart, right? He's a good guy. Well, one day he's wandering his roof, and he looks on and sees a naked lady. David had a desire in him for naked ladies, okay, everybody? He's a man, and he sees the woman, and, he does not start singing that song we learned in children's church, be careful, little eyes, what you see, for the Father up and down is looking down in love, so be careful, little eyes, what you see. He was lured, and he was enticed, and his eyes did not immediately look away and run, but sorry, the watch is listening to me. He's lured, he's enticed, and then what happened? That desire gave birth to disobedience. He says, go get that woman for me. He acts on it. The woman comes to him, and then that conception not that conception, that happened later, but the conception of the sin, where that desire led him into an action, a disobedient action. And so he has sex with this woman, and then an actual conception takes place, right, where she has a baby. Well, what's step number 3 is death. And what followed this action was terrible. Physical death and way more than that. So it led to, now Bathsheba's a married woman, and she's got this husband. And so David starts to get this plot together of how he's going to, he was a soldier, we're going to bring him home and try and, get him to sleep with her. We'll make him think that it's his baby, and it just fails. And so it gets to a point where David has to put this guy on the front line of the battle, have all the other soldiers withdraw so that this man can die. we see physical death that took place. And then you flip to the very next page, the very next chapter of this story, and that baby, the baby of David and Bathsheba, dies. It led to physical death. So he's been entrapped. He's lured by his own desire. He acts on it, and then it leads to death. And so you can see, as David's looking over this woman, he's probably thinking, oh, how fulfilling it would be, how great it would be. He's not thinking about the death that's coming on the other side. So we have to have the wisdom to know the process, of what's coming, of what's actually waiting on the other side of disobedience. And so when we talk about death in the Bible, a lot of times death talks about that physical death. Sometimes it's talking about spiritual death, and a lot of times it's talking about separation. So if you look at, the first mention of this, of death in the Bible, when you look at the story of Adam and Eve, right, they were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or what? They would surely die. Now, because of their sin, they would eventually die a physical death, right? That happened. But in that moment, they died a spiritual death, and they were separated from that perfect relationship with God. So it's the physical death, the spiritual death, the separation, and that's what sin does. Sin separates all the time. Where there is sin, it will bring separation. When there's gossip, it brings separation and division. And there's unfaithfulness in a marriage, it brings separation and division. If there's, lying in anything relationally, it brings separation. So sin always separates. Sin separates. So we got to know that process. It starts with the desire. It leads to disobedience. And it always gives birth to death. You never get what you were promised. You never get the slice of cheese. So this is the process of temptation. Then he says this: don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chooses to give us birth through the word of truth, that he might be a kind of first fruit, that we might be a kind of first fruit of all he created. So, I told you that you had to remember 6 things. Hopefully you're tracking. Here comes number 6, but I told you I'd make it easy, right? Here it is. Spoiler alert. Number 1 and number 3 are the same. Okay? We started with you got to know the source, but we were talking about temptation. But where we're finishing is you got to know the source of good. You got to know the source of what is good. When you know the source, you can go to what you're longing for, right? If you're really wanting a pizza, you don't go to Best Buy. And if you need a new TV, you don't go to Pizza Hut, right? If you know what you want, you got to go to the correct source. And so sin will never give us the things that God is the source of. The cheese is always a trap. We cannot actually get the cheese, right? The cheese looks good and the desire within us, but it leads to death. So we got to start with knowing the source. Where's this temptation coming from? We got to look at the man in the mirror and understand this. Then we got to know the process. That this desire, it gives birth and it conceives and it leads us to disobedience, and then that will lead us to death. And then finally, we got to know the source of good. We got to know the source of good. Just like we know the source of temptation, where's every good and perfect gift coming from? It comes down from God. So we can't be deceived. Don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. God is the source of good. Every good and perfect thing comes from him. And then he calls him the Father of light. I love that, right? You think of light, there's a lot of light in the Bible, right? The light and the darkness, and walk in the light as he is in the light, and God is the light, and in him there is no darkness. So we see a lot about light, but it calls him the Father of lights. And so the word Father, when you think of the Father, you are the man behind the babies, right? And so Father really, when we think of like God the Father, it represents creator, right? And so when it's saying that the Father of lights, it's talking about the sun, the moon, the stars. That's why some translations say heavenly lights. He is God, the Father, the creator of the sun and the moon and the sky. But within him, there is no change. We talked about this a couple weeks when we were talking about change. That there's no change in him. And life the lights change, right? The sun is different. We live in Florida, so I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the heat of the sun. We went to the beach just earlier this week, and we're sitting there under the umbrella. It's nice and comfortable. And then I got up to go help my kids with something, and I almost melted. Like the difference of just the shade, right? You know, and it's like talking about these shifting shadows. Like, this is not what God is like. He does not change. There's no shifting shadows. There's no variation. He is dependable. So, he is the source of good, and he never changes. He will always be the source of every good and perfect thing. He doesn't change. So, we should not be deceived and fall short. And what I love about this is that James, he makes this like so black and white. Like, listen, guys, this is easy, okay? Let me tell you the natural path of disobedience, and let me tell you the path of obedience to God. Let me tell you what happens when you follow your disobedience, and let me tell you where good actually comes from. And then you make the decision. You make the decision. And then in verse 18, he said, he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might become the kind of first fruits of all that he created. So he's talking about salvation. That God, through his will, chose to give us new birth. It was him. He provided it. He chose to do it. Through the word of truth, through the gospel, the message of Jesus, we can receive a new life. We can receive a new birth. So if you are here this morning and you've not yet made Jesus your Lord and Savior, I want to tell you that the ways of the world will never work. You will keep biting that cheese, and the trap will keep coming down on you. God is the source of good, and if you're ready for a change, run to him. God loves you. He loves you so much that while we were sinners, while we messed up that perfect world that he designed for us in the garden, Jesus came and he died on the cross. He gave his life for us because we are sinners, so that through him, his righteousness could be placed upon us. He lived the perfect life that we couldn't live. He gave that life up for us so his blood could cover our sin, and he offers us this new life. So if that's you this morning, I want to challenge you to run to him. Give God a chance. We have some people here on hand. We have a team in this room over here that would love to talk to you. If you have any questions, no one's going to pressure you into making any decisions, but if you feel any stirring in your heart, if you have any questions whatsoever, please, after service, make your way to that room and just ask some questions, get some information. Maybe today's the day that you feel Jesus tugging at your heart. Don't resist that urge. Because here's the cool thing, this kind of first fruits thing kind of seems weird. It's like almost you just want to pass over it. Fruit, whatever, you buy fruit in the grocery store, who cares? This first fruit was another one of those Old Testament kind of symbolisms that he makes. We talked a lot about how he calls back to the things of the Old Testament. And one of the things that they would do is they would give an offering of the first fruit. And this was a big thing. It was the first fruit. So it was the first of the harvest. So first fruits, it was the first and the best. We're going to give God the first and the best of the harvest. And that was an incredible thing because it's the first one. So the harvest comes, you give your first to God. And so that was a big symbol of faith because we're going to trust that God is going to be the provider. If I give him what's first, I'm going to trust that more is coming, that he's going to provide it to me, and then giving him the best. And then God turns it around and says that we are the first fruits of all that he created. He's the Father of light, the maker of the sun, the moon, the stars, everything in this galaxy. But he looks at us, the masterpiece of creation. And when we fell short and we fell into sin and we messed up that perfect world he created, he sent Jesus for us so that we could receive that relationship that he intended for us in the garden. So we become the first fruits of his creation. That James is reminding us that, listen, if you are here and you have made the decision to follow Jesus, you are a child of God. You are chosen. You are loved. You are cared for. You are his child, and he is the source of good. So don't run to the junk of the world. Run to your Father, the Father of lights, the Father of good. He knows what your soul is actually longing for, and you will never find it in disobedience. You will never find it in sin. So don't fall for the trap. Run to God. So temptation in life is unavoidable. We are all going to face it. You'll face it later today. You'll face it tomorrow. The enemy has not given up. He's not thrown in the towel. We will never become to a point where we're so spiritually mature that we're no longer eligible to be tempted. It's not going to happen. So we're going to face it. So what are we going to do? we got to have a plan. I pray that we would know the source, that we would start by looking at the man in the mirror, say, I'm a rat, and sometimes I have a longing for cheese, and I got to acknowledge that. I got to understand that I can't point the fingers, I can't blame God, I can't even blame the devil. I got to look at me. I'm the only one that I can control here. I'm the one who can have self-control. It starts with me. And then we got to know the process, that it starts with the desire. It leads to disobedience, and that disobedience always leads to death. And so through having that process in our mind, we can have the wisdom to know what's coming, to not fall for the trap, knowing it's a trap. The cheese looks good, but it's a trap. And so I know this process, it leads to death, and I'm going to avoid it at all costs. And what am I going to do? I'm going to know the source of good. And I'm going to run to God, the Father of lights, my Father who loves me, the Father who cares for me, the Father who sent his Son to die for me. He is the source of good. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we love you. And God, we thank you for who you are. And God, we thank you for the sacrifice that Jesus made for us on the cross. While we were still sinners, while we were living a life of selfishness and running from you, you ran after us. So God, I pray this morning that we would run to you, the Father of light. God, that we would not fall to the temptation, knowing the destruction it brings. So God, I pray that we would look at ourselves in the mirror and understand who we are, and that we would have a battle plan, that we would understand that desire, and that we wouldn't give in to the disobedience, but we would fight against it, that we would take every thought captive to make it obedient to you, that we would renew our minds, that we would run to you, knowing that it always leads to death. But you are the Father of life. So God, we turn to you, our Father. God, I pray if there's anyone here this morning, they feel that tugging on their heart, that they wouldn't pass it up, they wouldn't let this moment pass by. That Jesus, they would surrender that life, that they would quit running to the junk of the world, falling into the traps of the enemy, that they would begin a new life with you, Jesus. So God, we pray this morning. This in Jesus' name we pray.